in the course, we spoke about the Semitic tribes or Semites. And I explained that the term Semitic refers to people who speak a Semitic language. Semitic languages today would be Arabic, Hebrew, few people who still speak Aramaic, and Maltese, the language spoken on the tiny island of Malta in the Mediterranean. In ancient times, there were dozens of Semitic languages. And we use the term Semitic to describe a group of people because it is the one thing that we know they had in common. It doesn't necessarily mean that they belong to the same ethnicity, although in early times, language and ethnicity did come together. Today is very different. Anyone who speaks English could be of any ethnicity imaginable in the world, and English could be his or her first language. In ancient times, if you spoke a certain language, most likely you belong to the same ethnic group and sometimes even to the same tribe. So we use these linguistic terms to refer to ancient peoples. So a very important one that we talked about before was the Semites. The Akkadians were Semites, the Amorites were Semites, the Hebrews were Semites, the Assyrians were Semites, for example. So now we're going to talk about a different group, and this group is called the Indo-Europeans. The term Indo-European refers to a very large family of languages, probably one of the largest, and I would say the most widespread family of languages in the world. What languages belong to that family today? English is one, German, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, but also the languages of Eastern Europe like Russian or Polish or Serbian or Croatian. Actually, Serbo-Croatian is the same language. Greek is also in the European languages. Armenian. And then as we move to the east, Farsi, the language that they speak in Iran today, is Indo-European. Pashto, one of the main languages of Afghanistan, and many of the languages spoken in India, Urdu, Hindi, Gujarati, Bengali, Baluchi, all of these languages are also part of the same linguistic language. And what that means is that, like organisms, languages have a common origin. So if all of these languages today are Indo-European, it means that at one point there was one original language from which all of those languages derive. Sometimes this language is called as Proto-Indo-European. Proto means the first, the archetype of anything that exists. So the Proto-Indo-European language is the foundation of these other languages. And we have been able to determine that by studying the languages. We can look at words, that is, we can look at the vocabulary of the different languages, we can look at the grammar, we can look at the syntax. We know how, out of a certain way in which people spoke, one group derives certain practices and a different group derives other practices. And these techniques that linguists have developed to figure out the relationship among languages are pretty complex, but they're also very accurate because they do depict the process in which these languages develop. So by studying languages, we can then go back in time and get a sense of who or where the people who spoke these languages lived. So one of the big quests of history in the 19th century was to figure out who were these Indo-Europeans, who were the original source of all of those languages that are spoken now in the world, from India to Ireland, and of course through the colonization of the world throughout the Americas and places like Australia or South Africa or Nigeria, for example. So in looking for the origins of Indo-European language, historians started to well, linguists were looking at the origins of the Indo-European language. Historians started to look for the origins of the Indo-European people. So one of the main aims in this quest to discover the origins of the Indo-Europeans was to figure out where they came from originally, to find the Urheimat of the Indo-Europeans. Urheimat is a German word that means the original homeland of the Europeans. Where did this language, culture, and people first emerge? And there were all kinds of theories in the 19th century. Some people believe that they came from the Caucasus area, which is where the term Caucasian comes from. Others thought that they came from all the way up north. Some people thought that they came from Asia Minor, what today is Turkey. There were theories about the Indo-Europeans coming from Tibet. And there were even explorers who went to these different places trying to find proof that this is where the Indo-European people emerged. And of course, along with these ideas came also some other ideas that were not scientific. The notion that the Indo-Europeans, or Aryans as they were called sometimes, were a pure race, a race that had not been contaminated with anyone else. And when I use the term contaminated, that's not my term. That is the term that some of these people use. And unfortunately, that concept of pure races is going to have very, very negative consequences later on in history. This is why it is important to look at the origins of certain ideas. And we have to realize that even though a lot of these thinkers did not have any sort of evil purpose in mind, their ideas were translated eventually into ideologies and beliefs that had tragic consequences for humanity. But of course, this is not what we're studying now. What we're studying is the origins of the actual Indo-European people, and they did exist. There was a group of people who originally developed a language from which all of those languages that I mentioned before come. And also, language is just one of the many expressions of culture. So obviously, these Indo-Europeans also developed certain family structures, certain religions, certain values, certain ways of life that you do see projected in the civilizations that eventually came out of them. So according to the consensus, that is, most historians and anthropologists and linguists today believe that the Urheimat, the original home of the Indo-European people, was located in what is called the Pontic Steppe, around 4000 BC. That is some 6,000 years ago. And as you can see in this map, the purple section shows what the Pontic Steppe is. This whole area that extends in the east from what today would be Kazakhstan, across southern Russia, the Ukraine, what today would be Romania, and all the way down south to the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus Mountains are that section between the two bodies of water that you see in the middle, just south of the purple section. And I mentioned that before, the term Caucasian comes from that connection to the Caucasus area. A lot of what today we accept as part of the origins of the Indo-Europeans comes from the Kurgan hypothesis, which was put together by Maria Gimbutas, who was a great scholar who dedicated her life to the study of the Indo-Europeans. And she is the one that, through archaeological findings and putting together many other sources, was able to formulate a hypothesis of how and where the Indo-Europeans emerged. And her theories are the ones that are accepted by the majority of historians today. So what is the steppe? A steppe is a geographic term for grasslands that extend from Asia all the way to Eastern Europe. As you can see, it's pretty flat land with very tall grasses and crisscrossed by rivers. Sometimes you would find some hills, but for the most part, it's pretty flat. And what that means is that it is an area that can be traversed, can be crossed by groups of people who usually have herds of animals. As you can see in these images, it's like a sea of grass. It goes on forever. The distances are immense. If you can you imagine, you go to Western China and then you travel all across Asia, across Russia, across those central republics of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and then down into what today is southern Russia and the Ukraine, and then you arrive in what today would be Romania and Hungary. It is an immense tract of land. But that means that over the course of many centuries, it allowed the movement of different groups of people. And especially after the domestication of certain animal species. This became the perfect ground for the development of nomadic societies. And these societies are going to play an extremely important role in the future of humanity. They may seem to exist on the periphery of the great civilizations, but they had a profound effect on those civilizations. Whether we talk about China or India or the Middle East or Europe, the inhabitants of the steppes, of the Asian steppe, at different points in history had a crucial role in historical developments that took place there. Now, Maria Gimbutas's theory is called the Kurgan hypothesis. A kurgan is a mound on the flat steppe. If you looked at the previous images, the steppe is very flat. So when you see a mound like this, most likely this mound is man-made, and this is what Maria Gimbutas and other archaeologists figure out. These kurgans were actually tombs. Some of the peoples who lived there would bury their leaders mostly in these tombs. And what archaeologists found here were not only the human remains of those people, but also gifts of gold, weapons, horses, and chariots. You find kurgans mainly in what today is southern Ukraine and southern Russia, but this type of tomb, this practice extends all the way to what today is Western China. So it seems that these peoples who live over very, very long distances eventually adopted a similar practice in terms of the burial of their dead. And there are many elements that you can identify with this culture. It's definitely a warrior society. It's a society that is mobile because they have horses, and of course they have invented and developed these chariots that are used for war. The fact that you have weapons as gifts shows that this is a big part of the identity of those people who were buried there. And it is by studying these kurgans, these mounds, that Gimbutas and others formulated this theory that a lot of the material evidence found in these places seems to be the origin of objects found in other areas of the world. And therefore, it is from this point that that culture must have emerged. The first identifiable culture that involves the Indo-Europeans is what we call the Yamnaya culture. Between 3300 and 2600 BC, in this area that you see, which is just above the Caucasus, right? You see the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the area in the middle is the Caucasus region. The early Yamnaya or Yamna people settled or developed north of that, at the convergence of all of those rivers that you see there, the Don, the Volga River. And this is the original place where the Indo-European culture, the Indo-European language most likely developed. These people were nomadic, but we also know that they practiced some agriculture. And this is interesting because there was this notion that people go through stages, right? You go from hunting gathering to pastoralist, which is when you have animals and you have flocks of animals that you move from place to place. And finally, you have agriculture. And what we have discovered today through archaeology, but also by observing some societies that still are untouched by modernity, what we discover is that sometimes that evolution is not straight, and we cannot even probably call it an evolution in some senses. That people who are hunter gatherers sometimes become pastoralists, but once they become pastoralists, they do not abandon the hunting and gathering. We've also learned that there is horticulture planting, which is not really farming. It is basically just putting things in a patch and let them grow, and then you move on. So you can actually grow things, but not necessarily be sedentary, meaning that you live in the same place all the time. And then we've discovered also that sometimes when agriculture is developed, some people become farmers, but that doesn't mean that they abandon pastoralism. And what that means is that they farm, but then they also move to other places. So they may be seasonal farmers. Or we also have learned that especially here along the Asian steppe, some groups of people would become farmers for a few years, and then because of political or economic or climatic conditions, they decide to move on, and then they become nomadic for a while. They move along with their herds of animals and they live a nomadic life. And then after a few years, when they find suitable land, they decide to settle once again and become farmers. And one of the reasons we know this is because if you look at all the Indo-European languages, they all have basically related words, related terminology to agriculture. And what that means is that agriculture must have developed before the original Indo-Europeans split and formed different groups. So very early on, people like the Yamnaya culture were both farmers and pastoralists, and sometimes they alternated between the two ways of life. And here in this map, you can see how the Yamnaya culture spreads from this area in the Pontic steppe into the Caucasus, into Asia Minor, which is Turkey, west into Europe. Actually, they move all the way up to Scandinavia, and then they move east into Central Asia and as far as Western China. This image is animated, so you can see the sequence of how they move. And what is very interesting is that after they spread in the Pontic steppe, which is their original homeland, the second area where they appear is all the way east in China, which means that they move and they remain nomadic for a long time, and eventually they found a permanent home in what today is Western China. This area is an area where there was a language called Tocharian, and this language Tocharian probably disappeared by the 19th century, but linguists were able to at least record some of those words, and there are writings from the Middle Ages in Tocharian. And Tocharian is one of the most remote branches of the Indo-European language, which shows that the people who spoke Tocharian split very early on from the main body of Indo-Europeans. They moved, as you can see in this map, all the way far east in China, and they developed there. And eventually they were absorbed by the local tribes who spoke either Turkic or Mongolic languages. That area of China is the area where you find the blonde and red-headed mummies. Apparently, these people who spoke the Tocharian language buried their dead, similarly to the Kurgans, with weapons and gold, horses and chariots. And because of the dryness of the desert, the bodies never decomposed. They became mummified naturally. So when archaeologists found them, they discovered them, I wouldn't call them intact, but they still have, they're relatively well preserved. And you can see that many of them were blonde and redheaded. So it gives you a sense of how some of these people may have looked like at one point. In addition to language, archaeologists use material remains to make connections among culture. And here you have two examples of that. You have something called corded ware and axes. On the left, you can see this pottery that has a peculiar form of decoration, which seems that was made with cords, and that's why it's called corded ware. Pottery is created for practical uses, for cooking, for storage, for carrying water. But of course, people who make them have their own techniques. They improve upon the practicality of the object, and sometimes they want to make them pretty. And this is where archaeologists look at to find patterns, right? Because if a certain type of pottery shows this similar patterns of decoration, it means that the people who produce them are either the same people or were connected to the original creator of that design. So by looking at the spread of corded ware, we can figure out how the Indo-Europeans spread, because this is something that we first see among the Yamnaya. This is the way that they make their pottery. Quite distinctive. They also produce these axes. These axes are not made of metal, they're made of stone. Their axes existed everywhere in the world. Different civilizations produce different forms of axes. These ones have a peculiar style. So you can imagine how originally the people who developed these axes figure out that this is what works best for them. These axes are used for both work and war. So when we think about these early Yamnaya, these early Indo-Europeans fighting, these are the things that they're holding. You have a stick, you put it inside, and it is a pretty lethal weapon. Very, very powerful. And not easy to produce. It takes a lot of skill to produce one of these axes. So when you see these axes in other places, what does that mean? Either that the people who first produced them moved there, or they were traded for other things, or that eventually the people who met the original makers of this learned the technique from them. But what it shows is that there's obviously either movement of people or contact between peoples. In this map, we can see in yellow the first area of settlement of the Yamna or Yamnaya people. And then you see that corded ware, that is that pottery that I showed you before. We can see that spreading all along what today would be Germany, Poland, and parts of Russia. Through the area that is red. So you see that there's corded ware also in Scandinavia. And then there's that section that says globular amphora. Global amphora are these containers made of pottery, ceramic, that were used for storing grain. Globular amphora was typical of Central Europe. So what that means is that the Yamna had contact with whoever produced the globular amphora, but as they moved west, they brought with them their style of pottery, which is corded ware. In addition to the archaeological and linguistic evidence, these days we count with the evidence of DNA. And what we have discovered is about the early Indo-Europeans, and specifically the Yamnaya, and their spread is interesting. In this map, you can see how from the Pontic steppe, they moved down into what today would be probably Romania, into Central Europe, up into what today would be the Netherlands, eventually Britain, and then down into what would be northern Spain. Those are the blue lines. The red lines reflect the movement of a people called the Belbeker culture because of the type of pottery that they produce. And what happens here is that when you look at human remains of that period, what you can see is that there is a population replacement. The people who originally lived there, who had lived there for many generations, thousands of years in Central and Northern Europe and Britain, for example, their DNA does not appear in the record except for the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is part of the DNA that doesn't change generation after generation and therefore allows geneticists to trace the origins of certain people. The thing about mitochondrial DNA, however, is that it's only transmitted through the female line. On the male line, the Y chromosome is the one that doesn't change. And sometimes there are mutations, and the mutations allow you to become markers, and through that you can actually trace the origins of the movements of people. So this is what they found out. By looking at the Y chromosome DNA, that is the male genetic inheritance of the people of Central Northern Europe and Britain, you can see that there's no evidence, very little, almost no evidence of male Y chromosome DNA coming from the original inhabitants, the pre-Yamnaya people. However, when you look at mitochondrial DNA, that is the DNA found unchanged in females, you do see traces of both Yamnaya women who lived thousands of years ago and also pre-Yamnaya people, that is the women who were part of the original population. And what does that tell you? Well, what that tells you is that as the Yamnaya come in, they conquer the land, and what happens to the males who live there? They're killed. And the women are taken as the prize of war. And of course, that has happened in cultures since the beginning of time. So the lack of DNA information from those early men shows that they were exterminated in battle, most likely. And the women were not killed, they were kept, and obviously they reproduce with the members of the invading force. The red or orange lines that you see here represent another type of DNA, and that shows how people who live in the Iberian Peninsula move north, and in their case, they retain probably their independence, given that you still see a lot of traces of their DNA in the archaeological remains, that is in the skeletons that they have. But also, if you go to an area of Spain known as the Basque country, the Basques actually show DNA from the pre-Indo-European population of Europe. The Basques live in a mountainous area of northern Spain, so for centuries they have been protected. Actually, the Basques speak a language that is unrelated to anything else in the world, and we think that this language is descended of the original language spoken in Western Europe before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. So the Yamnaya, when we talk about the Yamnaya spreading and the type of pottery spreading and language spreading, we're talking also about war. These migrations are violent. This spread of a culture is not a friendly spread most of the time. It is something that happens through the exercise of violence. So far, we have seen how there is DNA evidence, there is archaeological evidence through pottery and weapons, but the languages also tell us the story. When you look at this map right here, which is around the year 3500 BC, that is 5,500 years ago. In the center, you see the section that says Yamnaya, Proto-Indo-European, And that is the Urheimat, the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans. The next time that you see evidence of Indo-European language in any other part of the world is all the way to the right. You see the area where it says Afanasievo, Tocharik. For these early periods in history, we don't really talk about peoples or ethnic groups as we talk about cultures, because we don't know really who these people were or how or what they look like, although sometimes we have some idea when we find enough DNA. For example, archaeologists found the body of a woman in Scandinavia, and they found enough DNA to figure out many things about her. And one of the things that they found was that she was blonde, she had blue eyes, but had very dark skin, which is really interesting, right? Because usually you don't associate those two together. So sometimes you can find really interesting things about what people looked like in ancient times, but those are the exceptions. We may assume that the Yamnaya people looked a little like some of their descendants, but we cannot say that for sure. What we do know is that the Yamnaya people had certain cultural things in common: language, religion. They were warlike. The types of weapons they produced, the type of pottery they produced, their way of life. That's what we call them a culture. Then, when you look at the right side of the map, you see the Afanasievo, and that's the Afanasievo culture. Afanasievo is the place where evidence was found, and they are obviously connected to the Yamnaya. There are many things that are similar, but there are also differences. So what that tells you is that the people who originated the Afanasievo culture were from the Yamnaya territory. They moved, they settled there. And the other element that we see here is that this is the area where the Tocharik or Toharic language was spoken up until the 19th century. For thousands of years, there were people there who called themselves by different names, but what they had in common is that they spoke a Tocharic language. And there were a few of them. These languages eventually were written when they borrowed writing systems from other cultures. So we know a lot about these languages, and we know that the Tocharic language separated from the rest of European languages very early. And when you look at this map, it's really interesting because you see red in the center and red in the right. So what happens in the middle? Well, we know that the people who spoke Tocharic must have crossed that area. What that means is that either they remained there, they just crossed that area, they remained there for a very short period of time, or when they were there, they were completely annihilated and there are no archaeological remains of their presence there. Most historians believe that a section of this Yamnaya culture decided to migrate to the east, and they remain nomadic for a long time, and that's why there's no evidence of them in the middle. And it's only until they settle all the way in the east, what today would be Western China, that we start to see archaeological evidence of who they were.